All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Hallie. I'm a member of the Quad Education team. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on the SAT and ACT. We'll take a deep dive into what each test contains. We have one of our fantastic admissions counselors here with us today who will walk us through this topic. And if you have any questions, you can ask those at the end. For those of you that don't know, Quad Education is an admissions consulting company, and we work with students and families through the entire admissions process, from just starting high school, figuring out your classes and extracurriculars, all the way through taking the SAT and ACT, filling out your applications, and getting into college. So I'll have our panelist introduce herself in just a second, and then we'll talk about the formats of the SAT and ACT. We'll go over the differences between the two tests. Then we'll go into the SAT sections and then the ACT sections. We'll go over a couple strategies for success and then open things up for a Q&A. So like I mentioned, pop those questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. Additionally, we are recording this webinar and we'll send out a link to it within the next few days. All right. So before we dive into the formats, Dominique, can you introduce yourself for us?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dominique. I am an admissions consultant here at Quad. So I work with students one-on-one to help them both, develop their candidacy throughout high school and then also craft their applications during application season in the summer after their junior year and fall of senior year. I have experience, my undergrad was at Dartmouth College, and so I've experienced both as a tour guide there working with the admissions office, and then also after college working as an alumni interviewer for the college. And then I also have some experience working in public education, both at the middle and high school level, advising students and kind of steering them in the right direction towards their college pathway and through that application process as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for walking us through this topic. So one thing that I'll point out before we dive in is we don't go in depth on the digital SAT, which is coming up soon. We will definitely be covering that in the future and do have material on our website about that. But right now we're just talking about the SAT and ACT as a whole. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the sections that exist on the SAT.
Perfect. So this is kind of a breakdown of what the SAT itself looks like. So just to kind of give a little bit of context, SAT and ACT are the two most commonly, or really the two only commonly accepted college admissions tests that kind of test your reading and math skills outside of any coursework you're taking. And so, there you kind of get to choose which one you want to take, kind of based on where your skills are and just what type of test environment and what type of test questions and things like that you tend to prefer. But I'll just to kind of say, to start out, neither one of them is better or worse than the other one. It's just all a matter of preference. And so I'll kind of break down the difference between the two, and then I can kind of help you to see, which you may want to invest some time in. So to start with the SAT, there are technically 4 total sections here. So you have a reading section, a writing and language section, and then the math section is broken down into calculator and no calculator sections, but it's scored as one total section. And then you'll see the number of minutes you have allotted here. So it's a total of 180 minutes. That's 3 hours long. I will say again, just very briefly, the test is moving digital, and we'll talk more about that in a future webinar, but the test will actually be quite a bit shorter when it moves digital. But not every single student will be digital, or the test won't be fully digital until this coming spring. And so it's not, going to be fully relevant for at least 6 months, essentially. So we're going to kind of stick with this one. So it's about 3 hours long. You have these 3, but really 4 sections. And then you can pretty clearly see the number of questions you have in the given time. And so you have, sometimes a little bit more than a minute per question, sometimes a little bit less than a minute per question, depending on the section.
Great.
Awesome. And then to kind of talk specifically about the math section itself, you'll see that it's broken down into these 4 categories. So we have heart of algebra, which is like your algebra 1, algebra 2, kind of equations, things like that. Problem solving and data analysis is a little bit more statistics heavy. So think graphs, charts, finding the mean and the median of a data set and thinking about what those things mean. Passport to advanced math is a little bit upper level. So, thinking more towards like closer to your like algebra 2 skills and things like that. And then additional topics in math, you'll see there's only 6 questions here. These can sometimes feel, quite honestly, a little bit random. I always like to give the example, if you've taken up through algebra 2 trig, like the equation of a circle, that is something that, is not a super huge topic, but sometimes will randomly show up on the SAT. And so it's definitely something to be aware of, to know. But it's questions like that where it's not, systems of equations or solving 2-step equations or something that's a huge topic, but it's still something that may or may not show up on the SAT at some point. Cool. And then just based on scoring, the SAT sections are basically combined to a score of 1,600. And so you'll get a score between 200 and 800 for just math. And then you'll also get a score between 200 and 800 for what's called evidence-based reading and writing. And that includes both the writing and the reading comprehension sections. And so those 2 scores that are out of 800 will get combined. And that's when you commonly hear a student getting, X number out of 1,600. Also importantly, the scores are, they're only given in 10-point increments. You can't get like a 406 or something like that. It's a 410. And then the next step is 420, et cetera. And so it's really just all based on the number of questions that you answer correctly. If you answer them incorrectly, it used to be that you would lose points. That is no longer the case. And so if you answer incorrectly, you just don't get the points. And so that's always kind of, definitely guess on this test if you don't know the answer. But essentially how the score is calculated is it's out of the numbers you've answered correctly, but then it's scaled just to make sure, different students are getting different test versions. And so that's to kind of ensure consistency. Some tests may be, ranked as a little bit harder than others. And so that they just kind of scale it to make sure that everybody's getting kind of an equal playing field for the test that they took.
Great. And thanks for calling out the points not getting taken away. Definitely is something we hear a lot. People want to know if they should guess on questions that they don't know or not. And it sounds like you definitely should, at least fill something out if you don't know the answer.
Yeah, correct.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the ACT. It seems like there's a few more sections here.
Yep. And so ACT is broken down a little bit differently. You still have your 4 core sections. So, the English the English reading, like what I said before, evidence-based reading and writing, that section is relatively the same. So you have your English, which is your like grammar and can you write a grammatically correct sentence and can you pick out when you're supposed to use a comma versus a semicolon, those kinds of things. That's tested in the English section, and that's pretty much consistent with what you see on the SAT as well. The reading section is also pretty consistent with what you see in the reading section on the SAT. It's just your basic kind of standard multiple choice reading comprehension question. So you'll read a passage and, the question will be like, okay, well, what did this character do at this certain moment? Or what does this word mean in the context of the passage? Things like that. So again, relatively kind of straightforward and relatively similar between the 2 tests. Where things tend to start differing quite a bit is when we get into the math section. So you'll see here, the math section is 60 minutes, 60 questions. And so it is relatively fast paced, but it's also incredibly straightforward, a lot of people say, as compared to the SAT. And so when I say straightforward, I mean, you're going to see less kind of verbose word problems where the focus on the SAT is, can you read this problem and can you figure out what it's asking you to do and then do it, as opposed to the ACT is just, it's going to be a lot of just solve this equation, or, what is the value for X, or, just very simple, here it is, can you do this calculation? In like the math teacher world, we talk about conceptual versus procedural understanding. The ACT is very procedural. Do you know what to do and can you do it quickly? Whereas the SAT is, do you understand, what this question is asking? Do you understand the concept behind, whatever mathematical procedure or formula or equation you're using? And can you execute with that? And so kind of depending on how you feel about math or what type of a thinker you are, one may be better than the other for you. And so that's definitely kind of a big sticking point when I talk to students about which test they want to choose. Definitely, how you feel about math and the way you solve problems really comes into play there. And then the other piece that's completely unique is the science section. And so the SAT does not formally have a science section at all. You may see science-focused passages in the reading section, but this is a dedicated section for science reasoning. And I'm very, I'm trying to be very intentional. And when I say science reasoning, I mean science reasoning. I don't mean science content. And so, yes, you will see chemistry, you will see physics, you will see biology, you'll see all of those things show up. But the science section essentially is yet another reading comprehension section, except one, the passages are very much about a certain science topic. And so whether you're reading, an experiment where you're getting like literally the background and the introduction and the data and what the experiment looked like, the methodology, all of those things, or you're getting just like some sort of article about science, you're being asked to analyze those given graphs, given charts, given data, et cetera. And so it doesn't necessarily require really any knowledge of science vocabulary or science, mathematics as it's used in science or anything like that. It's much more, can you analyze this set of data? Can you tell me, what the trend is here? Can you tell me what this scientist did as opposed to this one and which methodology was better? Things like that. So it's never going to ask you about like specific vocab or anything, as opposed to you really understanding like the scientific process and how to reason through both text, graphs, charts, and numbers in general.
Great. I think when I was going through taking these tests, I remember it being described as the SAT, you're learning how to play the game when you're studying for it, but the ACT, you're reasoning through the problems and they're very straightforward and logical. There's no tricks in the ACT where they're trying to trick you a little bit in the SAT.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last piece is an optional writing section. Students always ask about this. My advice tends to be, if you are either one, trying to say you didn't do so well, maybe in an English class, and you're trying to really make up for that or tell a different story than what's being told by your transcript, this is a good way to kind of, prove to colleges, hey, I can write a coherent essay. I didn't have so much luck in my freshman writing class, but I've grown a lot. And, I want to kind of show that with this score. If you're trying to get into like an English program or a journalism program or something like that, this may be helpful to kind of showcase your writing abilities, but it's not necessarily, at least in my opinion, always necessary if you're going into like a STEM major or something like that. It may not be as applicable or relevant.
Great.
And then the scoring is slightly different. This obviously can be converted. And so you can pretty easily just Google conversion between SAT and ACT. The ACT scores are out of 36. You'll get a score between 1 and 36. And it's just basically an average of all of the 4 sections. And so you'll get a separate 1 out of 36 score for reading, for English, for math, and for science. And then they'll all be averaged into your composite score, which is your overall score. And that will be, all 4 of those scores will be reported to colleges, which again is slightly different because on the SAT, you're reporting 1 math score overall out of 800. You're reporting 1 evidence-based reading and writing score out of 800, which includes English, and English and writing and reading combined. And so you're getting 2 out of 800 scores and then 1 composite out of 1,600. Whereas on the ACT, when you report your scores to colleges, you're going to get a single out of 36 score for each of those 4 sections: English, reading, math, and science, and then 1 overall composite score. Again, doesn't matter necessarily which test you choose, just slightly different kind of ways that the scores are reported. And of course, again, you can look this up and colleges know how to convert these things. And so they'll know, oh, you got a 36. Great. That's the same thing as a 1,600. Moving on. It doesn't matter, again, which test you choose.
Great. I know for the SAT, you can submit a super score. So you can take the highest score from each section and send that into colleges. So they're not seeing, one test you had a lower score because you didn't do as well in the math section. Can you do that for the ACT as well?
Yes. So you will need to check. So when you're applying, every school has a different policy. I will say right now, kind of where things are and where things are going, the majority of colleges are 1 test optional. So you don't even have to submit scores if you don't want to. You don't even have to take these tests. But 2, most of them will super score. And again, this super scoring is basically they're going to take your best individual section score out of every sitting. And so say you take the SAT once, you get an 800, a perfect score on the math section, and you get like a 600, you don't do so well on the evidence-based reading and writing. You go back, you do it again, you've really studied, you're really focused on evidence-based reading and writing, you get an 800, a perfect score, but because you were so focused on that, you kind of slip up in math and you get like a 700. Essentially what you would have across those 2 settings is you'd have your 1 perfect score from math, your 1 perfect score from reading. And the way that colleges would view it is they would kind of see that as a perfect 1,600, even though you didn't get the perfect math score and the perfect reading score on the same day or in the same sitting. And so most schools will do that. You just need to double check their policy. And that does apply to the ACT as well. It's kind of school specific, what they're going to accept and what they're not.
Fantastic. Thanks for outlining that. All right. So we did talk a little bit about the differences between the tests, but we'll go into detail here.
Awesome. Cool. So, a big difference, like I said, to recap, is those different sections. And so SAT, we have reading, writing, and language, 2 math sections, again, math with calculator, math without calculator, and then an optional essay. Out of 1,600, the essay score is reported separately. And then the ACT, 4 sections, slightly different: English, math, reading, and science. We still have that optional essay. Scale of 1 to 36. Something I didn't mention, which is, again, important in this decision, the ACT, in it being so straightforward, again, they just want to know, can you figure this out? Do it. You are allowed to use a calculator on the entire test. And so that's, again, just like a different kind of strategy. And you're honestly allowed to use a graphing calculator. Like you can walk into the room with a TI-84, right? Which holds a lot of information. And so if you are the type of person that's really good with your calculator, you're quick, you're ready to go, that, again, could play to your advantage, as opposed to on the SAT, quite honestly, on the no calculator section, the calculator may not even honestly help you too much. It's much more focused on, can you figure out what the problem's asking and can you reason your way through it?
Great.
And yeah, this is kind of just summing that up, right? And so again, mostly questions that emphasize critical thinking and problem solving on the SAT, a little bit longer to think through those, whereas on the ACT, it's a little bit quicker paced, and you just need to get right to it, answer the question, and move on. And I think I just mentioned this too. So the time constraints are slightly different, a little bit longer on the SAT, so you have more time to think through everything. But again, the ACT is a little bit faster paced. Again, just to briefly mention this, and I don't want to go in too deep, as far as the digital version, the SAT is going to be quite a bit shorter than it currently is. And the formatting, changes just a little bit. There's actually just going to be 2 sections with a break in between. Whereas now there's 4 sections. The ACT, however, will remain unchanged. And so even though you will be taking it digitally or taking it on a computer, The sections and the timing and the content, all of that will be completely the same.
Great. All right. Science section, I know we talked about a little bit, but we can briefly go over this.
Yeah. And so that's kind of, again, the big thing that people see. I think another piece of context I would give, and this honestly just draws from personal experience. I remember in high school, I loved science and I had taken like all of the electives. I was in all of these biology classes, chemistry, that was just my thing. And I was like, perfect. I'm going to love the ACT. I love science. I know so much. And it was just so different than what I expected. Like I said, I might as well have not taken all those classes, at least for the ACT sake, because it didn't ask me about any of the knowledge I had of, again, super science specific vocab or processes or anything like that. I could really have just gone into it not knowing anything about science and just really focusing in on, okay, I need to find this piece of data in the chart, or I need to take an average of this column and make an educated guess about, what kind of conclusion I can draw from this or whatever it may be. And so honestly, even if you are not a science person, don't write off the ACT. I would suggest trying them both, because you may very much have the type of like logical, just rational thinking that you need to get through the science section, even if you don't love science as a whole. So the only way for you to really know is to take both, take a diagnostic and see how you do and see how it feels. I would argue seeing how it feels is almost more important than seeing how you do, because you can always improve. You can always study, you can always learn the test, but knowing how each of the types of thinking and knowing how the pacing feels is going to be most important.
I think that's a great tip. Thank you. All right. Calculator policy. I know you.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself earlier, but the calculator policy is also, again, a very important consideration when you are thinking about which test to take. Just know that you'll be able to have that calculator with you on the math section the entire time on the ACT. And there's only one dedicated portion of the SAT where you'll be able to use a calculator. Importantly as well, the SAT offers a formula sheet that's like literally built into the test, and the ACT does not. I don't know that this is, as crucial as the calculator piece. I've found that oftentimes you don't even end up really needing those formulas, even though it's there. And so it can feel like, oh, I have this safety blanket, and you don't always need the formula for the volume of a cone or whatever it may be. It's some like random geometry formulas and stuff like that. But it is something that's there. Whereas the ACT, again, it's going to require a lot more just like knowledge. And so there will be cases where it will benefit you on the ACT to have literally memorized some formulas that may just be kind of given to you on the SAT.
Great. All right. So sections and questions, we'll dive into these a little bit more here.
Awesome. Yeah. So as far as the reading section goes, so there's quite a few different categories here. So big picture, little picture, right? This is kind of like, there may be like main idea questions. What is the main idea of the passage as a whole? That's what we would consider a big picture question. You'll get a lot of those. Little picture, they may be asking, okay, what is the point of this, the author including this one sentence? Or why did the author use this specific vocabulary word here? What was the effect of that? What was the point of that? That's what we would call a little picture. Inference questions, basically needing to draw an inference from, evidence in the text that is given to you. So it's not necessarily written there, but you need to figure out what it means or make your best guess as to what it might mean. Function questions, again, this kind of falls into little picture a lot of the time. It's, what is the point of this word? Or why did the author include this paragraph? Or would it have made more sense to put this paragraph before that paragraph? Those types of things. Evidence support, I would say, are the most straightforward types of questions. And so, what is the best evidence for this claim, right? And you have to kind of go in and figure out where the author gives the best supporting argument for whatever the claim is that the question's asking. Words and context, I already mentioned. Why did we use this word, or what does this word mean? And then author technique, again, why is it structured like this? Why Why did the author make this choice or that choice? And again, that's kind of an inference question. So these do kind of like blur together. But these are the general types of questions you'll see on the reading section. Writing and language, a little bit more kind of very straightforward, like literally grammar. Do you know how to use commas? Do you know how to use apostrophes? Do you know how to use a semicolon? Those types of things. And then just kind of like clarity of writing, that would go into expression of ideas. And so that's, again, just like a more straightforward, can you edit this essay and make it better? And then finally, we already kind of talked about these math sections. You have these main four. Importantly, and I think, this is something that a lot of students don't realize. If you are, the standard trajectory through math in high school would be in 9th grade to take Algebra 1, take geometry in 10th grade, Algebra 2 junior year, and then potentially like trigonometry, pre-calculus, etc. That's very, very standard, right? Obviously, a lot of students either double up on courses or they've taken Algebra 1 in 8th grade or maybe even Algebra 2 in 8th grade, depending on how far ahead you are or whatever it may be. When you are kind of ahead of that curve, it might make more sense for you to either take the SAT a little bit earlier than others, so earlier than junior year, or you're going to have to really make sure you're studying consistently, you are doing practice consistently, especially in this math section. I say all of that to say the content itself really only goes up through Algebra 2. And so if you are one of those students that's like taking Algebra 2 in 9th grade, as opposed to the standard taking it sophomore, junior year, you will perhaps have, kind of forgotten a lot of those things because you've been in calculus land for 2-3 years at that point by the time you're taking the test. And so, being ahead in math courses is awesome, but sometimes as far as, the standardized tests are concerned, it does require a little bit more intentional prep because so many of those topics are not going to be top of mind for you like they would be a student who's like very much kind of on track with the standard math progression in high school.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And then to go into the ACT questions, the English section, so they call them slightly different things. So it's called usage and mechanics and rhetorical skills here. Basically the same exact kind of stuff you're going to see for the most part on the SAT. So do you know how to use, do you know how to use commas or apostrophes, just that very like technical grammar stuff. And then rhetorical skills, clarity of writing. Can you say what you're trying to say in the most concise way possible? And so it might ask questions like, well, what's the best way to say this? How should they phrase this? Usually the shorter, the better is kind of always the answer. If it makes sense, obviously the shortest answer will usually kind of win out there. Math section, pre-algebra, elementary algebra, like Algebra 1, intermediate algebra, Algebra 2, coordinate geometry. There's actually a lot more geometry represented on the ACT as well, just kind of like another small thing. So if you are one of those people that just loves geometry, this might be a good place to shine. So coordinate and plane geometry. And then trigonometry is also represented pretty significantly here as well. And so I always lump that into Algebra 2 because I know most people take those together. So definitely something to brush up on if you do plan on taking the ACT. For the reading section, there's quite a bit of categories here. Again, they're relatively similar, just kind of called different things. And so main idea questions versus detail questions, right? Big picture, little picture. Cause and effect questions, vocabulary questions, sequence of events questions, right? This is like, why did should these paragraphs be moved around? Or, when did this happen compared to this thing, or author's voice? It's really all of the same basic kind of categories, just kind of spelled out a little bit differently. And then finally, you have your science section, which is completely unique.
Science. Sorry, it says math there.
Yeah. And so as far as what this is, data representation is a big category there. And so it's, again, can you read this graph? Can you read this chart? research summaries? Can you read through the methodology and the conclusion from 2 different, scientist experiments and talk about the difference between the 2? Conflicting viewpoints. Can you read like literally kind of a dialogue or an argument between 2 different scientists and the argument they're trying to make about a certain scientific phenomenon and talk about, the pros and cons of the 2 arguments and kind of analyze those. Again, it's so hard, I think, to talk about these things just like so broadly like this. The only way for you to understand this is to just take it and look at it and see how it goes. Where these specific subcategories will come in handy is when you're kind of analyzing how you're doing, and you can go in and say, oh, this was a cause and effect question, right? I got 4 cause and effect questions wrong. Maybe that's something specific I need to work on. I need to study how those work. And so, getting a sense of what these questions look like is great. And then being able to go back in and kind of code them as, here's what these were, here's why I got them wrong. Let me make sure I kind of focus in on my weaknesses. That really is the name of the game. And so these will come in handy someday. They're a little hard to talk about when you haven't really experienced the test, but definitely keep these in mind. Google them and just like use them as you go through your prep.
Great. All right, so let's go over some strategies for success before we dive into the Q&A. So if you have questions, pop those in the Q&A box and we'll get to those in just a couple minutes.
Awesome. So kind of like what I was saying before, study plan is key, especially if you are maybe at a point where you're not going to be seeing a lot of this math content and things like that pretty regularly before you take the test. Importantly, targeting weaknesses is a big piece of this as well. I know I just mentioned that. It does not do you any good to practice things that you got right the first time, right? Of course, stay fresh with them, do 5 or 10 questions a week on stuff that is relatively easy for you. But you'll get overwhelmed if you try to study every single thing every single week or whatever your study schedule looks like. And so really, again, taking the time to do a diagnostic and then figure out, okay, it's like these 3 categories of things that I really struggle with. Study those things, go back, take a practice test, see how you do, and then kind of work through that. Areas of weakness is just by far the easiest way to kind of make those really big gains very quickly. I think a lot of students tend to just be like, well, I'm just going to do random questions because I need to know everything. And that really waters down the practice you're doing because you get a false sense of like, well, most of these feel easy, so it's great. But then you're never going to truly get better at those 2, 3, 4 things that you really, really need to focus on. And then timing yourself is another big one. I always recommend, taking regular practice tests, whether it's, at the beginning, every 6 weeks. If you have, say, a year plus to prep, take regular practice tests every 6 weeks, maybe every 4 weeks at some point, to just make sure that you are able to perform under testing conditions. It's one thing to kind of casually sit around and do problems and Google it when you get the answer wrong right away and, kind of try to figure that out. It's another thing to answer 60 questions in 60 minutes and make sure that you can get through that whole thing. And it's not even about always just being quick enough to do that. It's about being able to focus for that long, right? Can I sit down and maintain energy for 60 minutes and get through this? You may be fast enough to do 10 questions in 10 minutes, but can you sit down and like actually, think for 60 minutes straight without looking at your phone or taking a break or something like that? That's a totally different story. And I think it, so many students sometimes don't do as well as they would like to when they sit down and take an official test because they just don't know what that feels like to be under that stress for that amount of time.
It's definitely a whole different game changer. Also at, 8 a.m. when these tests generally happen.
So that's kind of another big thing too. So when you are taking practice tests, just take them under as ideal of test conditions as you can. Obviously it will help you to take, if you do plan on taking the digital test, when that comes out, practice on your computer. If you are taking it on paper, print out a bubble sheet, and literally fill in the bubble sheet. Just get as used to all these little things as possible. That way, the majority of your brain power on the test day can be on the questions themselves, and not like, oh my God, I forgot how to do this. It's been a while since I've used a paper and pencil because I'm always on my computer, whatever it may be. Last two big things here: hire a tutor or form a study group. Not everybody necessarily always needs a tutor, but I always recommend it. Just like working with a quad counselor may benefit you, just because you have that one-on-one person that can just really get to know who you are and just help you come up with an individualized plan. A tutor works in the same way. They can really get to know, okay, what are your weaknesses? They can force you to sit down and take that diagnostic test, even if just for, sitting down with someone and having that structured time, 60 minutes a week, twice a week, whatever it is. That can help you quite a bit in reaching your goals. Study groups are great too. If you don't want to pay for a tutor or have that, super, super structured way of going about things, get some friends to study with you, or I know that some schools have like SAT, ACT prep clubs where everybody gets together and, just practices together. It's always great to get, just help from peers and different perspectives, and you can share resources and all those things. And it's a little bit less daunting when you have some people to go through it with. And then the last thing here would just be practice self-care. This always goes without saying, but I think sometimes it's just so easy to forget. Stress can cause poor test performance. If you are stressed out, if you have not slept enough, if you have not eaten enough, the morning of and even leading up to the test, you may not do as well as if you feel super prepared, you've been exercising, you've been eating well, you've been taking care of yourself, and you can just really focus on test day on just, the questions themselves, as opposed to, well, I don't feel good because I haven't been sleeping because I've been studying late at night or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. To take care of yourself, for sure. All right. Well, Dominique, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. I know we covered a lot. We do have additional webinars that you can find on our site that go a little bit deeper into these subjects, as well as downloadable guides that take even more of a deep dive. You can also reach out to us for tutoring, and we can help you out there as well. All right, so feel free to pop some questions in. We have some time to answer those. We do have one question. Someone wants to know if they're planning on starting college a little bit early in a dual enrollment program. Is it okay for them to take the SAT in 10th grade and not 11th? Is it okay to take it earlier? And should you take it earlier if you are in a similar situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on every situation. I would say just because you are going into dual enrollment doesn't mean you need to take the SAT. You can absolutely wait until spring of junior year. I wouldn't wait until senior fall. Some people, I would say senior fall is kind of reserved for, I'm taking it a second, third time to get my score up, as opposed to taking it for the first time. But you can't take it too early. If you are prepared, if you have taken all of those required math courses, that you have all the content, if you have the time, right, which is another thing. And so there are some situations where I actually really encourage students to take it early, because I'm like, all right, your junior year is going to get crazy. You're taking AP Calc and AP Physics and AP Chem and just all these classes. Junior year is just notoriously super tough. So if you do have a little bit more, maybe free time to study and commit to it 10th grade, absolutely, I would suggest doing that. I wouldn't rush it. If you don't feel ready and if you don't feel like you have the time to commit to the prep, there's no need to take it early, but there's no harm in doing it either if you feel like you're in the right headspace to really kind of dial in and get that score you're looking for.
Great. How long do you recommend students study for the SAT and ACT? Is it something you should be doing from the start of freshman year? Is it a couple months?
Yeah, it's a good question. I usually recommend students at least take a diagnostic test sometime during freshman year. Mm-hmm. Usually towards the end of the year, definitely by the time you are kind of in sophomore fall. Depending on what school you go to, you may take like the PSAT 8-9, the PSAT 10, which is, as it sounds, PSAT practice SAT. It's a practice version of the SAT that's given at some schools at the beginning of each of those grade levels, just to kind of measure where you are. PSAT is slightly different than the SAT, especially those leveled ones. PSAT 9 is slightly kind of leveled down towards freshmen, so it's not quite as rigorous. It doesn't cover quite as much material. Same thing with PSAT 10. And so those are great, just kind of ways to get exposed to the test. If you do want to truly, truly start studying, and like I said, you feel like, well, I've already taken Algebra 2 and I'm ready to really get into the heart of this, take a diagnostic real SAT. That way you can see exactly where you are on the actual test itself. Same goes for ACT. So definitely, I tend to talk generally about the SAT, but SAT and ACT, again, super interchangeable. You can take whichever one you want. So I always suggest start early and take both, see how it feels. And then you have time to figure out, okay, well, this is the one I really like. Maybe I'm not doing so well just by studying on my own. So you have time to course correct and get a tutor or whatever it may be. So earlier the better. I would say late freshman year, early sophomore year is a good time to really start thinking about a diagnostic test, and then either, oh, wow, I didn't do as well as I'd hoped, I should probably get a tutor, or let me try studying for a bit and then I'll get a tutor later if I don't improve.
Great. Can you clarify what you mean by a diagnostic test? Do you mean students should go and take the actual SAT and ACT or use a diagnostic test resource?
That's a great question. So you absolutely do not need to sign up and pay for a real test kind of right from the beginning. So there are diagnostic tests. Diagnostic is just like a practice test. It's just a publicly available test that you can take. That's either like a previous test that's been used, or it is put out by these companies. So it is a real test that can give you a sense of how you might do on a real SAT or ACT. You can literally just log in. You'd make a College Board account for SAT, and ACT has a separate kind of sign in. So you would go to that website and they have publicly available diagnostic tests that you can take, and it'll give you like a scoring guide. And like I said, if you're going to take the paper version, you'll be able to print out a bubble sheet. You can score yourself, and then you can go back and say, oh, great, these 6 questions I got wrong were from Passport to Advanced Math. That's the thing I need to study most, or whatever it may be. But yeah, it's just a practice test. It's available online. You can do it at home. Try to simulate the test environment as best as you can. Like I said, wake up, try to do it at 8 a.m. Get a good night of sleep the night before. Stick with that timing, all of those things, so it feels as real as possible. But you don't need to sign up and go through all of that for an official test.
Great. All right. If anyone else has any questions, pop those in. In the meantime, Dominique, do you have any additional tips that you give to your students for when they're studying for these tests, or anything we didn't cover that you want to make sure we touch on?
That's a good question. I would say, again, just to kind of underscore the importance of really just taking the time to figure out what feels good for you. That's the importance of starting early. So, again, try both tests, see how you do. You can start by self-studying. I highly recommend, and this is kind of a feather in the SAT's cap, I highly recommend Khan Academy for practice. Mm-hmm. It's a completely free resource. They have an amazing just suite of SAT, prep materials that are available online. You can sync up your College Board account with your Khan Academy account. And so if you do take, say, the PSAT, or you do take an official test, it will sync up your answers or your scores. And it'll basically say, hey, based on how you did on your last test, here's what you need to focus on. Here are some questions that we recommend you try because these are what you need help with. Here are some videos if you're still not getting it. And so that's an incredible resource that I always highly recommend. If you are going to go the ACT route, there are certainly online resources, there are books, there are all of those things, but just get a sense for what works, and then just also get a sense for what works for you as far as practice. If you are the type of person that's going to want to log into an online account every day, or if you do need the structure of having a tutor that you're going to meet with, whatever it may be.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for all of this information. And thank you to everyone for joining us. We appreciate you spending your Sunday afternoon learning about the SAT and ACT. Keep an eye out for an email with a recording of this webinar if you want to review it. And also keep an eye out on our site for upcoming webinars you can sign up for as well. And as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Dominique, thank you again so much for being here. It was great to have you.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.